In small-town America, where everyone knows your name, and good families know good families, Margaret Hamilton stood tall as a pillar of society. She taught children at the local school, played the piano every Sunday at the First Methodist Church, and spent summers directing the library's reading program. To the entire town, the Hamiltons weren't just respected, they were trusted. But all of that would come crashing down on one cold November night. When Margaret failed to return home, Sheriff Walsh mounted a search that might be the equal of a military operation. He organized volunteers in groups of 6, each team searching the terrain with method. Farmers showed up directly from church, dressed in their Sunday finery. The volunteer fire crew brought ropes and stretchers, while the church ladies provided coffee and sandwiches from long folding tables. It was a snapshot of small-town solidarity, until the questions started. Dorothy Hamilton sat shaking in the sheriff's office, attempting to remain composed as she made her statement. Her voice remained firm, until the deputy asked for a description of what Margaret had worn the night before. At that point, Dorothy's control broke. The coffee cup fell from her fingers, and the room was silent. The search started where Margaret's car, a powder blue Chevrolet, was discovered. Men spread out in broad circles, sweeping across the frozen cornfields, eyes keen for a hint of movement. Two bloodhounds, borrowed from the state police, tracked Margaret's trail from the car to a drainage ditch, and then nothing. The scent just ended. "It's like she vanished into thin air," said the handler. Or perhaps, he added quietly, she was taken. They combed every barn, every silo, every acre of ground. They trudged through frozen ditches, rummaged tool sheds, even crawled through culverts big enough to conceal a corpse. Nothing, not even a hint. When they shouted Margaret's name into the trees, their voices were consumed by the leaden November sky. By Monday, the search had been expanded 5 miles in all directions. State police arrived, radios crackling, maps on the hoods of patrol cars. They questioned all who had attended the Thompsons' party, where Margaret was last seen alive. The same story came from every witness. Margaret had been happy, calm, perfectly normal. She'd said she needed to get home to grade papers. She'd hugged her best friend goodbye, walked to her car, and drove away into the night. Then, nothing. Dorothy produced a photograph taken the summer before, Margaret smiling in front of the school. Squinting from the sun, the sheriff had hundreds made. Her face was soon omnipresent, taped to storefront windows, pinned to telephone poles, festooned in post offices throughout 3 counties. The sheriff's office phone never stopped ringing. Sightings came in. A woman thumbing rides outside Springfield, an individual seen at a St. Louis bus station. But each one ended in failure. As the week drew to a close, Sheriff Walsh was confronted with a bleak reality. Margaret Hamilton wasn't missing. She was missing, and whoever had taken her was still on the loose. Then, a break. Also, it would turn out. Tuesday morning, Henry Dubois appeared at the sheriff's office. He reeked of motor oil, his coveralls dark-stained from work. He'd remembered something that had been preying on him since Saturday night. About 10:45, maybe closer to 11, he'd driven by Jacobson's filling station on Highway 47. In the red light of the mobile sign, he saw Margaret's blue Chevrolet, and Margaret herself, standing beside the car, conversing with a man. He didn't think anything of it at the time. But now, with Margaret dead, that memory felt crushing. Walsh took Dubois straight back to the station to backtrack. The mechanic couldn't pin it down exactly. 10:45, possibly 10:50. The man's face. He wasn't able to make it out. But the build rang a bell. Margaret didn't seem to be scared, just chatting, normal, unfazed. For the first time in days, Walsh's hopes flickered to life. Perhaps they did have a legitimate lead. But then came Wednesday, and another tale. Sarah Lemoyne, who was driving home from her sister's house, swore she saw Margaret too. Same night, same car, but in Sarah's account, the Chevrolet wasn't close to the gas station. It was already several miles away, traveling east on County Road 12. And Margaret was by herself. Sarah recalled it vividly, both hands firmly gripping the wheel, eyes straight ahead, no one else around. She was certain of the time. She'd even looked at her watch. 2 witnesses, 2 accounts, both adamant. Both impossible to harmonize. Walsh spread a map of the county out on his desk, tracing the roads with his finger. If Dubois spotted her at the station at 10:45, how did Sarah manage to overtake her on County Road 12 at almost the same time? One of them had to be lying. But who? Then Thursday morning brought more confusion. Bill Halfman, who was a farmer and lived close to the Thompsons, came to the sheriff's office. He'd also seen Margaret's cart, about 11 p.m. on the shoulder of County Road 12, hazard lights flashing. Margaret was standing outside the car, and behind her, another car, dark, possibly a truck, possibly a sedan. Halfman assumed someone was already assisting her, so he kept going. That was the last anyone saw of her alive. Sheriff Walsh ordered his deputy to return and re-question all of the witnesses. But the harder they pushed, the more the truth eluded them. Times changed, details melted together. Dubois wasn't so sure now. Perhaps it was nearer 10:30. Sarah stuck by her story, but even she conceded, perhaps it was another road altogether. And so, the trail turned cold. Perhaps it wasn't Highway 47 at all. Perhaps it was the parallel road, the one that wound its way through the darkness, almost indistinguishable under the faint light of the moon. And then another turn of events. Bill Halfman phoned the sheriff's office once more. This time, he believed he had caught a glimpse of that parked automobile on Friday night, not Saturday. The hours, the days, they were all getting confused. The inquiry was swamped in contradictions. Each witness had good intentions, wanting to assist, but their recollections changed like sand blown by the wind. Sheriff Walsh saw they were pursuing specters, attempting to construct fact on foundations that would not hold. One thing was unshakable. Margaret Hamilton's automobile was discovered abandoned, motor still running. And Margaret disappeared. All the rest do, all the sightings, all the memories, was chaos. Ordinary citizens attempting to recall ordinary experiences that had become extraordinary overnight. The second week passed, and there was still no body, no tangible leads. Sheriff Walsh was beginning to feel the walls closing in on him. The state police were demanding movement. The Springfield newspapers featured headlines that portrayed Carlinville as some kind of place where young women could disappear like mist. Dorothy Hamilton showed up at the sheriff's office every morning, her face thinner each day, her questions cutting closer, her hope fading, and Walsh, he still had nothing to say. The town was at a loss. They needed an identity. They needed a culprit, and so, as it ever does, terror had its target. The stranger theory gained traction. Evil, folks thought, couldn't have originated in Carlinville. It had to have blown in from elsewhere, from a stranger who wasn't one of them. Walsh directed his attention toward the migrant workers, the men who moved through Illinois each harvest season. They went north to south, from Wisconsin's apples to Illinois' corn to Florida's oranges. When winter arrived, they bedded down in trucks, barns, or run-down boarding houses, paid in cash, no receipts, no history. If villainy had descended upon Carlinville, it may have looked like a stranger's face. Walsh began at Rita Sullivan's boarding house on Oak Street, the sort of establishment that reeked of old wood and grounds from coffee. She had a tidy ledger, handwriting in curlicues, each payment noted manually. Walsh replicated the October and November entries, 17 names in total. All but 3 were already gone. But those 3 men remained in town, hoping for work at the Morrison grain elevator. He brought them one by one. 2 of them had alibis, parting at Hannigan's Tavern the Saturday night with half the town for witnesses. The third man was different. He'd signed the book as James Costa, approximately 35 years old. Thin, weathered, with calloused hands and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He had no alibi. Costa sat in the interrogation room with a kind of stillness that made the deputies uneasy, the stillness of someone who'd seen rooms like this before. He said he'd been walking that night. Just walking. No destination. Had he encountered Margaret Hamilton? He said he didn't recognize who that was. When her photograph was shown to him, he looked at it for a very long moment, face impassive, then said perhaps he had seen her, perhaps not. He saw many people. Where in particular had he been walking? By the fields, he replied. Perhaps the highway, don't remember. Walsh held him for 48 hours, the maximum without charges. State Detective Robert Fraser came down from Springfield to assist with questioning. They worked Costa in shifts, same questions, different phrasing, waiting for a crack, a slip. But Costa's tale never wavered, largely because it didn't really exist. When they searched his room in the boarding house, they found only a duffel bag, 2 shirts, a razor, a dog-eared paperback. No blood, no weapon, no sign of Margaret. They were compelled to release him. Walsh stood and watched the man board the morning bus, racked by 2 intolerable possibilities. He had just let go an innocent man. Or a killer they would never find. The stranger theory fell apart shortly thereafter. And with it, so did the case's momentum. Winter fell on Carlinville. Snow-covered fields where men had hoped to find. Thanksgiving passed and Thanksgiving came, then went. On December 1st, frost coated the vacant playground outside Carlinville Elementary, and Margaret's desk was still empty. Eventually, the principal found another teacher to hire. The case went cold. Years passed. Spring 1962 came with a gentle heat that made the sound of church bells a little sweeter. Farmers spoke of bumper crops, and preachers spoke of resurrection. Albert Becker, a reserved widower who tilled the same 200 acres just east of town for 30 years, made up his mind in April to extend his southern boundary line, encroaching deeper into the area of unbroken woods that edged Morrison's forest. It was the sort of place children talked about with hushed voices, when nobody ventured after nightfall. Becker worked alone, as always, hand-digging post holes, since he didn't rely on machines for precision work. The ground was soggy from springtime rain, soft, yielding, until his shovel hit something firm, not rock, not root, something else. He knelt and scooped dirt away with his raw hands, and stopped. A white curve was breaking the surface, smooth, unmistakable, bone. Becker backed away, his heart pounding. He'd been a medic in the Great War. He recognized human remains when he saw them, not another thing touching. He went to his truck and drove directly to the sheriff's office and informed Deputy Kenneth Murphy what he'd discovered, his voice shaking despite his attempt at remaining calm. Murphy called Sheriff Walsh, older now, slower, his hair grayer than brown. In 5 years since Margaret Hamilton disappeared, he'd carried that case like an anvil tied to his chest. Walsh and the county coroner, Dr. Richard Taylor, a man more used to delivering babies than studying bones, drove out to Becker's property. 18 inches beneath the surface, spread by time, weather, and animals, rested what was left of a human skeleton. Dr. Taylor examined the bones silently, the depth of the soil, the positioning, the jaw, female, young, wisdom teeth just erupting. Walsh didn't require the coroner to complete the sentence. 5 years of guilt came crashing down all at once. Margaret Hamilton, discovered less than 2 miles from where her car had been found. They'd already searched those woods, just not deep enough. They'd called out her name 4 days, called into the wind, into the woods, over the fields, while she'd been lying beneath their feet all along. The bones were transported to the Springfield State Forensic Lab. Sheriff Walsh demanded that Dr. Richard Taylor go with them himself. He stood next to the forensic pathologist, as each fragment was painstakingly placed on the table, a hideous puzzle with too few pieces. It was still 1962, and the science of forensics was in its infancy. No DNA testing, no chemical profiling, no computers with which to compare information nationwide. Only X-rays, dental records, if they could get them, and the trained eyes of pathologists who had learned how to read bone like a book. 3 weeks later, the report was back: female bones. Estimated age, between 20 and 30. Time of death, approximately 4 to 6 years prior. In line with 1957 or 1958. Cause of death, unknown. No bullet wounds, no breakage, nothing conclusive. There had been some trauma to the skull, but no one could say if it occurred before death or years later. It wasn't sufficient. Walsh turned to the last resort for assurance: Margaret Hamilton's dental records. Her former dentist, Dr. Paul Reynolds, had retired and relocated to Arizona, but his records had endured. They were shipped to Springfield, accompanied by a formal request for comparison. And then the waiting resumed. Dorothy Hamilton waited too. She was 28 now, unmarried, still resident in the White House on Elm Street, still working at the same elementary school where Margaret once taught music. Her life had come to a stop the day Margaret's did. When the comparison returned, it wasn't the answer she'd prayed for. A few of the characteristics matched, a few didn't. The forensic odontologist identified two fillings that were consistent with Margaret's dental record, but the general health of the teeth prevented a positive identification. He went to his truck and drove directly to the sheriff's office and informed Deputy Kenneth Murphy what he'd discovered, his voice shaking despite his attempt at remaining calm. Murphy called Sheriff Walsh, older now, slower, his hair grayer than brown. In 5 years since Margaret Hamilton disappeared, he'd carried that case like an anvil tied to his chest. Walsh and the county coroner, Dr. Richard Taylor, a man more used to delivering babies than studying bones, drove out to Becker's property. 18 inches beneath the surface, spread by time, weather, and animals, rested what was left of a human skeleton. Dr. Taylor examined the bones silently, the depth of the soil, the positioning, the jaw, female, young, wisdom teeth just erupting. Walsh didn't require the coroner to complete the sentence. 5 years of guilt came crashing down all at once. Margaret Hamilton, discovered less than 2 miles from where her car had been found. They'd already searched those woods, just not deep enough. They'd called out her name 4 days, called into the wind, into the woods, over the fields, while she'd been lying beneath their feet all along. The bones were transported to the Springfield State Forensic Lab. Sheriff Walsh demanded that Dr. Richard Taylor go with them himself. He stood next to the forensic pathologist, as each fragment was painstakingly placed on the table, a hideous puzzle with too few pieces. It was still 1962, and the science of forensics was in its infancy. No DNA testing, no chemical profiling, no computers with which to compare information nationwide. Only X-rays, dental records, if they could get them, and the trained eyes of pathologists who had learned how to read bone like a book. 3 weeks later, the report was back: female bones. Estimated age, between 20 and 30. Time of death, approximately 4 to 6 years prior. In line with 1957 or 1958. Cause of death, unknown. No bullet wounds, no breakage, nothing conclusive. There had been some trauma to the skull, but no one could say if it occurred before death or years later. It wasn't sufficient. Walsh turned to the last resort for assurance: Margaret Hamilton's dental records. Her former dentist, Dr. Paul Reynolds, had retired and relocated to Arizona, but his records had endured. They were shipped to Springfield, accompanied by a formal request for comparison. And then the waiting resumed. Dorothy Hamilton waited too. She was 28 now, unmarried, still resident in the White House on Elm Street, still working at the same elementary school where Margaret once taught music. Her life had come to a stop the day Margaret's did. When the comparison returned, it wasn't the answer she'd prayed for. A few of the characteristics matched, a few didn't. The forensic odontologist identified two fillings that were consistent with Margaret's dental record, but the general health of the teeth prevented a positive identification. The Thompson farm was converted into a peaceful suburban tract. Most of the folks who had known Margaret were dead. The younger folks only knew her name, a legend, a tale told on Halloween. The schoolteacher who disappeared. Dorothy Hamilton died in 2003, peacefully. In her sleep at age 74, when the house was sold, the owners discovered Margaret's room, just as it had been left, the same clothes in the closet, the same books piled neatly on the desk. 46 years locked in silence. Her possessions were given to the library and to the Historical Society. The house received a fresh coat of paint, a new kitchen, a new flooring. And with that, the final physical remnants of the Hamilton sisters disappeared, all but one. A tiny grave marker in Oak Hill Cemetery, Margaret Hamilton, beloved sister. 19341957. Gone, but not forgotten. The case remained formally unsolved, not because anyone was still looking into it, but because no one had ever formally closed it. By 2005, it was ancient history, mentioned only on dusty internet discussion boards about unresolved mysteries. And still, in police records all over Illinois, the case remains. 3 boxes, a handful of photos, a pile of yellowed reports, no suspect. No resolution, only questions that never ceased ringing through the empty fields of Carlinville. They had cried out her name 4 days. Cried out through the cornfields, through the trees, through the night, unaware all the while that Margaret Hamilton was buried just below their feet. The remains were taken to the State Forensic Laboratory in Springfield. Dr. Richard Taylor, the county coroner, went with them personally, resolved to follow through on the examination. He saw the forensic pathologist lay out each bone on a long metal table, piece by piece, like a horrific puzzle waiting to be solved. In 1962, forensic science was hampered by the technology of the day. No DNA testing, no chemical tracking, no computerized databases matching missing people to the deceased. Their best bet was X-rays, dental charts, and experienced eyes of pathologists who had spent their careers learning what bones could, and couldn't, tell. The breakdown took 3 lengthy weeks. When the report finally returned, it provided more questions than answers. The remains were those of a woman, estimated to be between 20 and 30 years old. Time of death, 4 to 6 years prior, around 1957 or 1958. Cause of death, undetermined. No bullet wounds, no obvious fractures, no slash wounds. Just a single faint spot of damage on the skull, perhaps due to violence, perhaps due to weather, perhaps due to time. It wasn't enough to solve the case. They required a positive identification, so Sheriff Walsh set out to find Margaret's dental records. Dr. Paul Reynolds, her childhood dentist, had retired to Arizona the previous year, but his replacement had retained his files. The records were sent to Springfield to compare. And then, once more, everyone waited. Dorothy Hamilton waited above all. She was 28 now, unmarried, still residing in the White House on Elm Street, still working at the same elementary school, where her sister once played piano for morning assemblies. Her life had continued, but only in the very smallest, quietest terms. When the dental comparison returned, it was inconclusive. Some features were a match, others were not. The forensic odontologist identified two fillings in the upper molars that matched Margaret's charts, but the condition of the teeth made a positive identification impossible. A likely match, 60% confidence. It was the sort of answer that provided no comfort whatsoever. One Thursday evening during that June, Sheriff Walsh went out to Elm Street himself. He sat across from Dorothy in the low light of her living room lamp and informed her that they'd discovered remains, which could be her sister's. Could be. The word lingered in the room, toxic, ambiguous. 5 years of nothing. And then they had something, and yet, it wasn't enough. The case was reopened as a homicide investigation, but without identification, cause of death, or suspect. The trail went cold once more. The bones were designated Jane Doe, and stored in the evidence room. Margaret Hamilton, technically, remained missing. And so, time started its slow, merciless creep forward. The legend of Margaret Hamilton grew to a murmur, small-town gossip, whispered at diner counters, and told again at church suppers. Mothers cautioned their daughters against driving alone on county roads in the dark. Her photo, worn and yellowed, remained tacked to the sheriff's bulletin board, surrounded by fresh cases that passed through. Dorothy never married. She never left the White House on Elm Street. She taught second grade for 37 years, smiling softly as generation succeeded generation of children learned to read in her charge. When she retired in 1994, the town presented her with a plaque and a standing ovation. But everyone realized that she talked less and less each year. That some part of her remained stuck in November 1957, still waiting for the sister, who never came home. She never stopped searching. Every new sheriff in Macouping County received a letter from Dorothy within a month of being sworn in, courteous, nagging, requesting progress. She wrote to the state police, to forensic centers, to private detectives, who didn't respond often. She cut out newspaper stories, followed missing person cases throughout Illinois, and wrote theories and guesses in scrapbooks. She sought patterns, for any hint which might link her sister's disappearance with something larger. But the boxes marked Hamilton, Margaret missing person, November 1957 remained unopened in the sheriff's office basement. They weathered to office remodels, one basement flood, and even the county's conversion to digital databases rather than paper files. No one discarded them, but no one opened them either. The case was just too old, too cold. Sheriff Walsh retired in 1973. He passed away 5 years later from a heart attack. His replacement, Robert Clark, would occasionally pull the Hamilton file when a reporter called, typically near the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance. He'd deliver the same line every time. The case remains open. Any new information will be investigated. Then he'd close the folder over, put it back on the basement shelf, and not give it another thought until the next time. The town surrounding Margaret Hamilton's memory continually shifted. Highway 47 was broadened and repaved. The Calabarn, dating from the old days, toppled in a windstorm during 1981. Jacobson's filling station turned into a stop-and-go convenience store with a fluorescent sign. The Thompson farm was subdivided, replaced by rows of uniform ranch houses with 2-car garages. The individuals who had known Margaret in person were no more, dead, relocated, or too elderly to recall vividly. To younger citizens, she was merely a myth, the schoolteacher who disappeared. Dorothy Hamilton passed away peacefully in 2003, at the age of 74, in her sleep. When her home was bought by a young Springfield couple, they discovered Margaret's bedroom untouched, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her books in neat stacks, her lesson plans piled on the desk, 46 years frozen like an altar. Her possessions were given to the library and to the Historical Society. The house was painted anew, floors renewed, a new kitchen installed. All vestige of the Hamilton sisters disappeared, except one. A tiny headstone in Oak Hill Cemetery, Margaret Hamilton, beloved sister, 1934 to 1957. Gone, but not forgotten. The case was technically still open, but only because no one had ever taken the trouble to close it. By 2005, it was ancient history, buried under decades of more recent crime and newer tragedy. Nonetheless, somewhere in the records, 3 dusty boxes sit together on a shelf, a quiet testament to all that Carlinville lost one November evening. No suspect, no answers. Just questions that wouldn't stop ringing through the vacant fields. Detective Lawrence Gallagher had testified in court more times than he could count. His commendations lined a drawer in his home office, tokens of a long, distinguished career. But when retirement finally arrived, it didn't usher in the peace he had anticipated. Rather, it ushered in restlessness. He was driving the interstate in the evening, going past the Carlinville exit repeatedly. And each time he came by, slowed down, and thought about one name that still lingered with him, Margaret Hamilton. Her file had sat on his desk in 1989, when he was conducting a cold case routine audit. It was just another unsolved disappearance at first, one of dozens stored in state archives. But as Gallagher read the reports, the witness testimonies, the autopsy, the details of those strange bones in the woods, something didn't feel right. The more he read, the more certain he was that the initial investigation had missed something important. Something that could possibly still be lurking in those 3 old evidence boxes. He attempted to reopen the case officially, but his bosses blocked him. Too old, they told him. No witnesses, no suspects, no budget. But Gallagher was not the sort of fellow who abandoned a project just because someone asked him to. So he began appearing at the Carlinville Sheriff's Department, weekly, then twice a week, gradually gaining the trust of the sheriff in office, Daniel Murphy. He discussed the progress that had been made in forensics, how contemporary DNA analysis was able to do what science in the 1960s could not. For the first time in decades, hope existed. However, hope alone did not finance an investigation. Gallagher penned letter after letter to the state's attorney general, to the Illinois Crime Lab, even to university forensic experts who worked on cold case DNA. His appeal was straightforward. The bones in that storage room deserve a name. And Dorothy Hamilton deserves to know, one way or another, what became of her sister. And then, in 2008, the breakthrough occurred. Illinois introduced a new cold case DNA initiative, 30 cold homicide files chosen for re-investigation with forensic analysis in cutting-edge technology. Thanks in large part to Gallagher's tenacity, Margaret Hamilton's case was included. At last, after a half-century, her bones would tell their story again. The remains were taken to the State Forensic Laboratory in Chicago, where they were worked on by Dr. Sarah Kennedy, a forensic anthropologist trained at the Smithsonian. She was an expert at recovering mitochondrial DNA, the type that is inherited through maternal lines, the type that can remain in bone and tooth fragments for centuries. The process was arduous. 50-year-old bones were delicate, dirty, and obstinately unwilling to yield to analysis. 4 months had dragged by. Gallagher phoned Sheriff Murphy weekly, pacing his office like a defendant in a jury room. Then, on one September afternoon, the first report came in. Dr. Kennedy had succeeded. DNA had been extracted successfully from the femur and some of the teeth. The profiles were poor, degraded, but viable. They simply required a comparison. Dorothy was gone for so long, and she never had children. So police looked to the next best option, maternal relatives. It took weeks to find one. Eleanor Walsh, Margaret's first cousin, now 81 years old, and residing in a Peoria retirement home. She still recalled Margaret all these years later, the search parties, the nights of sirens, the subsequent silence. When she was asked for a DNA sample, she did not hesitate, only a quick cheek swab. 30 seconds that could close out 51 years of questions. The results were received in November 2008. A mitochondrial DNA matched of a 99.7% likelihood. The unidentified body discovered in Morrison's Woods in 1962 was definitively that of Margaret Hamilton. Half a century of guessing finally gave the mystery woman in the woods an identity. She'd been there the whole time. Buried less than 2 miles from where her car was discovered, under soil walked over by searches countless times. There was a press conference that December. Sheriff Murphy faced the department building, Gallagher at his side. The chill wind slicing through microphones. The local news reported the story. The Springfield dailies ran coverages. Even some national blogs covered it, before dropping it for other newer tragedies. Margaret Hamilton was no longer a secret. But her murderer still was. The case was now active homicide. Although in their hearts, Gallagher and Murphy knew the chances were dim. 51 years had gone by. Evidence had been lost. Witnesses had passed away. Memories had eroded. Nevertheless, Gallagher was not prepared to give up. He staked out a small, vacant office in the sheriff's department, and made it his own war room. The walls were plastered with photographs, reports, and newspaper articles. A lifetime of fixation boiled down to paper and ink. He read it all over again, word for word, searching for what everyone else had overlooked. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in January of 2009, he did. It was buried at the bottom of Box No. 3, under piles of witness testimony, tattered flyers, and yellowed logs of evidence. One envelope, with Sheriff Thomas Walsh's name on it. Postmarked December 3, 1958, over a year after Margaret had vanished. The letter was opened, read, and then, forgotten. The handwriting was concealed, written in stiff block letters, just one paragraph. But its words sent Gallagher's skin crawling. I'm a concerned citizen. I know something about Margaret Hamilton's disappearance. I saw her the night she went missing, arguing with a person she knew very well, someone that everyone in this town trusts. Investigate why he departed in such haste. Investigate the fabrication, he explained to his wife. That was it. No signature, no name, just a threat. Gallagher double-checked the file. No reference to follow-up interviews. No interview notes from Sheriff Walsh, nothing. The letter had fallen through the cracks. But this wasn't a vagary or a psychic stream. This was specific. A time, a place, a person Margaret knew. He took the letter to Sheriff Murphy the next morning. Murphy read it twice, then looked up. If this is the case, he whispered, then someone did see her that evening. And whoever she was with, that's our guy. They began excavating. Gallagher read through all the old newspapers he could get his hands on, scrolling microfilm until his eyes were dry. He wrote down every business that went out of operation, every family that just up and moved, every individual who left town during the months following Margaret's disappearance, 32 names total. He cross-checked them against witness testimony. Anyone who had been at the Thompson party, the night of Margaret's disappearance, anyone who lived around the spot where her car was discovered, anyone who could have known her well enough to get her to pull over on a rural dark road. One name was mentioned twice, Walter Fitzgerald. He was 34 in 1957, proprietor of Fitzgerald Hardware on Main Street, a hardware store his father had opened in 1928, married to Helen Fitzgerald, a reserved woman who sang in the church choir, to daughters, 8 and 6. Walter Fitzgerald closed up his store 3 months after Margaret disappeared. Packed up his family, moved to Springfield. No one could recall why Walter Fitzgerald was more than a familiar face in Carlinville. He was the one everybody greeted on Main Street. The town councillor, the Little League coach, the man who made the 4th of July parade start on time every year. Everybody liked him. Everybody trusted him. He'd been at the party of Thompson on the evening Margaret Hamilton disappeared. Left at 10:30 with his wife. Drove home to take over babysitting duty. Several guests attested. His name appeared in the file of investigation only once, briefly, and then forgotten. An innocent footnote, or so it seemed, but 3 months after that, an odd thing occurred. Fitzgerald Hardware, An institution in town for decades, shut down unexpectedly. Walter explained to friends that his father had become ill in Springfield and required assistance with another family store. It was a handy explanation, plausible enough that no one raised an eyebrow. On a chilly Tuesday morning, neighbors observed the Fitzgeralds loading furniture onto a moving truck. The two young girls wept as they bid farewell to their classmates. The family was gone, vanished, erased from Carlinville as silently as if they'd never existed there at all, by the next week. But the past doesn't ever really get away. It just bides its time. 51 years on, retired Detective Jack Gallagher tracked down Walter Fitzgerald to an assisted living center in Springfield. 86 now, thin, in a wheelchair, Parkinson's disease creeping away his dominance. His wife, Helen, had passed on years before. His daughters had their own families, living miles from the shade of the town that once worshipped their father. Gallagher approached with caution. Interviewing a dying man about a decades-old murder wasn't something you rushed. With Sheriff Murphy and the social worker present, he entered the small sunlit room where Walter sat by the window, hands trembling, eyes dulled by medication. Gallagher introduced himself, explained why he'd come, and placed a faded photograph on the table. Margaret Hamilton, 1957, smiling in the crisp autumn light. For a long time, Walter said nothing. Then, his eyes filled with tears. His voice, thin and broken, finally escaped his lips. "I've been waiting for this conversation. For 51 years. That single sentence changed everything." Over the next 2 weeks, in 3 separate interviews, Walter Fitzgerald confessed. His lawyer sat beside him. His daughters listened just outside the door, their faces crumbling, as they heard the truth unravel. He'd known Margaret from the time she started teaching at Carlinville Elementary. His oldest daughter had been in her class. Initially, their contacts were routine, courteous exchanges, parent-teacher conferences, one-sentence conversations at school gatherings. But along the way, something happened inside Walter. He came to feel things he couldn't help, things that frightened him, because Walter was no random man. He was a good man, a man who was admired, respected, a husband, a father. The thought of desiring another woman, particularly a woman like Margaret, blew the image he had of himself. He never talked about it, never gave in to it. But the fixation grew silently 4 months, until the night of the Thompson party. That evening, he watched Margaret from across the room, watched her laugh, dance, talk with other men, and something inside him snapped. He left early with Helen, drove her home, and then lied. Told her he needed to check the hardware store, said he'd forgotten to lock the safe, but Walter didn't drive downtown. He drove toward the Thompson farm. The night was quiet and cold. On County Road 12, he noticed the light of Margaret's Chevrolet. He pulled in front of her, got out into the road, and signaled for her to stop. Anxious, she did, rolled down her window. "Is everything all right?" she asked. He explained that he had to speak with her. Something significant about his daughter's schoolwork. Margaret believed him. She always had. She pulled over and got out of the car. There, in the quiet of the November night, Walter confessed everything. His emotions, his anguish, his sense that perhaps, just perhaps, she felt the same. Margaret listened quietly. And then, with kindness, she told him the truth, that she was flattered, but she didn't share his feelings. That he was married. And this conversation could never happen again. She turned to leave. And in that moment, something within Walter Fitzgerald, husband, father, community figurehead, snapped beyond mend. She told him gently, nearly with apology, that she was complimented, but she didn't feel the same, that he was a married man, a father, someone she held in esteem, that this couldn't be. She suggested they both simply pretend the conversation never happened. Then she walked towards her car, and in that instant, something within Walter Fitzgerald broke. He clutched at her arm, pleading, begging, then attempted to kiss her. Margaret shoved him away, shocked, terrified, and Walter lost control finally. He hit her, once. The impact was tougher than he'd meant to use. She stepped back, struck her head on the ragged lip of the drainage ditch, and went down. There was a horrendous silence. Walter paralyzed. Later, he said he thought that she died immediately, although he never checked for a pulse. He never called for aid. He stood there, mute with fear. In a few moments, his instincts, perhaps his guilt, seized control. He picked up Margaret's dead body, put her in the bed of his truck, and headed out into the darkness down the road to Morrison's Woods, an isolated spot he'd visited as a kid. The fall earth was soft, ground wet from rain. He dug as he could, buried her under layers of leaves and earth, and returned her car to County Road 12. He left the engine idling, the door ajar, staged it as an abduction. Even threw one of her shoes into the grass to make it realistic. Then, in one of the most spine-tingling aspects of all, he drove the 2 miles back to his own truck, returned home, and went to bed beside his wife, like nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. And that's how he lived for 51 years. March 7, 2009. 51 years, 3 months, and 21 days since Margaret Hamilton disappeared, Walter Fitzgerald was apprehended. Police went to the Springfield Assisted Living Center. The proud man who once marshaled parades and coached Little League now sat shaking in a wheelchair, struggling to get a spoon to his lips. But the law does not grow old, nor does conscience. He was charged with first-degree murder. The news exploded in Carlinville like a bomb. Walter Fitzgerald, the good-natured hardware store owner, the volunteer in the community, the man who had repaired folks' equipment and coached their children baseball, was a murderer. Older citizens couldn't comprehend it. They recalled him well, the creaky wood floors of Fitzgerald Hardware, Helen Fitzgerald's renowned pot roast at church socials. Everyone had cried when the Fitzgerald family left in 1958, believing it was a tragedy. No one knew what they'd actually been leaving behind. For younger generations, the name was mere legend, until today. Because today, it meant something much more sinister. That the monster who terrorized Carlinville for decades had been living right among them. 3 weeks following Walter's arrest, Gallagher's inquiry uncovered another name, Raymond Douglas. Raymond had been Walter's best friend back in 1957, his assistant manager at the hardware store. He'd lived in a rented room over the pharmacy, unobtrusive and quiet. When Walter relocated to Springfield, so did Raymond. Nobody gave it a second thought. But when state police came knocking on his door 50 years later, the truth came pouring out. Raymond came clean. He'd had all the secrets. The morning after Margaret vanished, Walter had appeared on his doorstep, hysterical, trembling, pleading for assistance. Raymond accompanied him to Morrison's Woods. Both of them probed deeper, buried the grave deeper, threw leaves and twigs to conceal the disturbed earth. Walter paralyzed. Later, he said he thought that she died immediately, although he never checked for a pulse. He never called for aid. He stood there, mute with fear. In a few moments, his instincts, perhaps his guilt, seized control. He picked up Margaret's dead body, put her in the bed of his truck, and headed out into the darkness down the road to Morrison's Woods, an isolated spot he'd visited as a kid. The fall earth was soft, ground wet from rain. He dug as he could, buried her under layers of leaves and earth, and returned her car to County Road 12. He left the engine idling, the door ajar, staged it as an abduction. Even threw one of her shoes into the grass to make it realistic. Then, in one of the most spine-tingling aspects of all, he drove the 2 miles back to his own truck, returned home, and went to bed beside his wife, like nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. And that's how he lived for 51 years. March 7, 2009. 51 years, 3 months, and 21 days since Margaret Hamilton disappeared, Walter Fitzgerald was apprehended. Police went to the Springfield Assisted Living Center. The proud man who once marshaled parades and coached Little League now sat shaking in a wheelchair, struggling to get a spoon to his lips. But the law does not grow old, nor does conscience. He was charged with first-degree murder. The news exploded in Carlinville like a bomb. Walter Fitzgerald, the good-natured hardware store owner, the volunteer in the community, the man who had repaired folks' equipment and coached their children baseball, was a murderer. Older citizens couldn't comprehend it. They recalled him well, the creaky wood floors of Fitzgerald Hardware, Helen Fitzgerald's renowned pot roast at church socials. Everyone had cried when the Fitzgerald family left in 1958, believing it was a tragedy. No one knew what they'd actually been leaving behind. For younger generations, the name was mere legend, until today. Because today, it meant something much more sinister. That the monster who terrorized Carlinville for decades had been living right among them. 3 weeks following Walter's arrest, Gallagher's inquiry uncovered another name, Raymond Douglas. Raymond had been Walter's best friend back in 1957, his assistant manager at the hardware store. He'd lived in a rented room over the pharmacy, unobtrusive and quiet. When Walter relocated to Springfield, so did Raymond. Nobody gave it a second thought. But when state police came knocking on his door 50 years later, the truth came pouring out. Raymond came clean. He'd had all the secrets. The morning after Margaret vanished, Walter had appeared on his doorstep, hysterical, trembling, pleading for assistance. Raymond accompanied him to Morrison's woods. Both of them probed deeper, buried the grave deeper, threw leaves and twigs to conceal the disturbed earth.